is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of DeFi Decoded. I am Alex Tapscott here with Andrew Young. Just me and Andrew today, so we're going to talk about a bunch of different topics. Today, Apple is up 6.5% after announcing that it has not developed its own AI, but instead will be integrating OpenAI into its operating system. So I don't know how the biggest, most profitable company in the history of capitalism is incapable of creating its own chatbot, but it seems like it has. So Siri's basically going to be OpenAI powered from now on. And what's amazing is, the days when people used to put blockchain in their name and the stock price would go up 25%. Apparently that can still happen today to mega cap tech companies when they announce something in the AI space. So Apple adding tens of billions of dollars. Actually, 6% of 3 trillion is $180 billion. So $180 billion its market cap in one day on the back of an AI announcement. Just feels like AI is in the air at the moment. Andrew, any thoughts on what's going on in the broader market?
Not too much. I guess one thing is it kind of reminds me of the crypto market in terms of just a couple huge kind of like blue chip companies are leading are kind of leading the entire market upwards, even when the vast majority hasn't been doing too well. There's like the whole meme about how it's what is it, the Magnificent Seven, and then the S&P 493, and just talking about how like there are wildly diverging performances, and it's definitely similar to crypto, where Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, and then like meme coins have been doing really well, and a vast majority of other things have been doing pretty poorly. So.
Yeah, I know. I mean, in the crypto world, it's basically like Bitcoin. Bitcoin's the thing that it's down a bit today, but has actually reached its all-time high this cycle. No other asset has, including Solana, which has had this like epic run, still way below its all-time highs from the last go-around. I mean, the big winner, obviously, in the AI race has been NVIDIA so far. I mean, it's worth keeping in perspective how quickly this company has grown. The company has doubled in share price since the beginning of the year. It's added the equivalent of Amazon's market cap to its value. And today it stands at around $3 trillion, which makes it, after today's surge by Apple, probably the third biggest publicly traded company in the world. So go Microsoft, Apple, and then NVIDIA. This is a company that not long ago, its market cap was, $300-400 billion before OpenAI announced ChatGPT-3. And it has some people, including myself, drawing certain comparisons to the dot-com era. Now, I'm not suggesting that NVIDIA is wildly overvalued or something like that. If anything, it kind of gets cheaper every time it reports earnings because it continues to produce these blockbuster results and to guide higher revenues than it had previously. But in some ways, it is sort of similar. The equivalent of NVIDIA back in the dot-com era was a company called Cisco Systems, which obviously still exists today, but is actually in 2024 way below its all-time high from the dot-com era. And basically, Cisco made all of this infrastructure, routers and switching technology that basically was considered like the backbone of the web. And people were buying up Cisco because it was sort of viewed as a way to kind of own a piece of the internet. And this was during an era when the application layer of the web was pretty thin, right? There were some search engines and there were some other applications and websites and landing pages, but people hadn't quite figured out how the web was going to truly disrupt and reimagine industries. And so in the absence of that, people were buying up Cisco. And I think the same thing is true today for NVIDIA. It's like, what is the way to play AI? Well, the way to play AI is by the chip manufacturer that makes all of the GPUs that all these hyperscalers like Microsoft and Amazon and AWS are buying, because they're going to keep buying them because they're the ones who are trying to test and build and do all this kind of stuff. But in the dot-com era, it wasn't Cisco that created all the value. It was companies like Google and Facebook that were able to disrupt industries like Google did with online search or Facebook did with social media, for example, or Amazon with e-commerce. And I think the same thing is true here with NVIDIA. NVIDIA today makes the infrastructure, but there will be companies and perhaps protocols that leverage this underlying infrastructure to build new kinds of applications we haven't thought of. And the reason I'm talking about this at length is because I actually think it's quite similar to the way things work in crypto. And to your point about there being winners and everybody else, right now, most of the value capture in the crypto world has happened at the protocol level, and specifically with Bitcoin, Ether, and I suppose Solana and a couple of these other names. But just Bitcoin and Ether together are 70 or 75%, right, of the whole market value of the industry. And some people have suggested, Joel Montenegro wrote this very famous essay years ago called the Fat Protocol Thesis. I'm sure you're familiar with it. That a lot of value capture is going to happen at the protocol layer because this is different than the old web where everything was sort of open and free. And I think that maybe there's some truth to that, but also it could be that we're still early. And you've mentioned to me a couple of times how we're seeing this sort of like ratio of protocols to apps looking like way out of proportion, and you've got a point of view on that, which I think is really interesting. So, like, how do you think about this question of where we are and how people are investing now in infrastructure versus apps?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's kind of funny because I remember actually talking to Charlie Morris, who is the pod. He's been on the podcast a couple of times, I think 3 or 4 times. We should definitely get him back on. But I actually remember talking to him about 5 years ago about this. So about how there was like way more chains than there are apps. And what's funny is 5 years later, there's still way more chains than there are apps, or like good apps, I should say. So take that with a grain of salt. The fact that it's been 5 years and nothing's really changed. But there's definitely been an explosion of new, mostly L2s, and now we're starting to see L3s, which effectively are kind of like a chain, effectively. And we still haven't really seen that many breakout crypto apps. So there's kind of like a meme in crypto that there's like more chains than there are apps, and there's more apps than there are users, which is kind of a funny way to put it. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but I think one of the things that's been interesting is for the most part, chains have had much higher valuations than apps. And so what that has led to has essentially led to 2 things. The first is that there are a number of applications that once they reach a critical size, they are sort of incentivized to become their own chain, their own L2.
Yeah.
Partly, I think, like, there's definitely practical reasons to doing it. One, you get to control your own gas costs, you get sovereignty, you get tons of flexibility. But then also there is like the value add of like essentially capturing more value and maybe getting kind of like a multiple expansion. I'm not sure if teams like think about it that way, but that's definitely something that's there from like an investing perspective. And then the second thing is that there's so many chains, and to be honest with you, it's a very different environment than we were 5 years ago when there was essentially no alternative to Ethereum that was EVM compatible and actually worked. Now there's tons and tons of chains that are all EVM compatible. They all have extremely low gas costs, and they're fighting over like a relatively small pile of apps. And so I think what's going to happen is it's sort of setting up for like, we'll call it application fall. That's the official meme I'm going with. Which is there's a ton of infrastructure and a ton of grant money chasing a relatively small pile of actually good apps. And those apps, for the most part, at least from like a valuation perspective, have definitely been beaten up relative to like these like chains. And so I think there's likely going to be kind of like a narrative forming around good applications that have sustainable sort of tokenomics, like real value capture, and actually have product market fit. I would say that's like probably one of the most exciting areas of the market. I'm obviously biased as an application developer myself, but so take that all with a grain of salt. But it does seem like that does seem like something I could definitely see happening, especially as more and more of these L1s and L2s are spending tons of grant money, which the applications then use to bring on more users. So, I would say there's the pendulum has swung too far into infrastructure, and I think the pendulum's going to swing back into actual end consumer crypto use cases.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be some cyclicality to that as well. Like I think we saw some of that, protocol growth and L1 growth, even in the last, or not the last, two cycles ago, like the 2017, 2018 cycle. And that's actually when projects like Solana first launched and got funded. And then what followed after that was, DeFi summer and a period where there was lots of like really interesting applications, as well as lots of infrastructure development. So I do think we might see that again soon. I always struggle with this concept because right now, infrastructure plays do command higher valuations because people view them as sort of foundational to this new era of the web, and lots of apps get built on these things. They can capture a lot of value in the process. But the upshot of all of this is that we end up with this incredibly fragmented, disunified ecosystem with different protocols, some of which talk to each other, some don't, with different technology that's compatible or incompatible. And I just find it's like so freaking chaotic. Like, one of the benefits, at least, of the World Wide Web was that a lot of the technology was open sourced by the US government, and everyone was kind of building off of the same playbook, sort of. And that's just like not true today at all. And I just don't know how this manifests in the long run, I mean, what's a really popular app that everyone uses today? Instagram or TikTok. But is the Instagram of the future, whatever that looks like, and I have no idea, I'm not saying it'll be a social media application, but an app that 2 billion people use? Are we bridging? Are we running 40 different versions of this across different chains? Like, are we using all this convoluted jargony terminology? How does that translate into the user experience? Do people need to know all that crap in order to just use an application? I just think like we really think about how this stuff scales and we're really honest with ourselves. I think it's going to slow things down. Like, I'm not sure that all of this innovation is good. It seems like it's innovation for innovation's sake versus actually like thinking about how you scale Web3. But maybe I'm becoming cynical. What do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely a little cynical. I go through stretches of that as well. I would say, I mean, again, you have to take a step back. I think we talked about it on the last episode that we're kind of like 1998 bubbles of internet of adoption, and that actually might even be overestimated because in crypto it's actually hard to know individual users because I could have 50 different wallets and therefore count as 50x the amount of users or whatever. So I think we're probably even earlier, if you want to use that analogy. And I think like it's kind of crazy how far the space has come in the last 5 years, but it's still quite unusable for the vast majority of people. Like when we first started in like 2019, there was the biggest crypto app in the world. Like blockchain app had I think like less than 1,000 daily active users, which is like comically small. Like only like a few crazy people on like Twitter even knew about them. And like we've made a lot of, we've gone from 100 pretty crappy dApps to 10,000, and maybe there's like 100 good ones now. Say they're mostly obviously in like the DeFi space. One other thing too is like financial applications is inherently kind of like a niche aspect of of all the different use cases you could kind of use crypto and blockchain for. But I think it's partly because of the fact that like on-chain transactions have been incredibly expensive up until like just the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to really know if that's just because we haven't had enough time with real like super low transaction fees to even like start building out other things. And for example, like I believe Arbitrum just launched a huge $100 million like Arbitrum grants program for on-chain gaming. So like, video games, stuff like that, because like essentially their whole thesis was like, the infrastructure is finally ready. Like now is the time to really invest. And so that's just happening now. I think there's maybe like one other L2 that's focused on it, which is Immutable. But like that's just like one example of like a use case that is effectively only become possible in the last year. So yeah, I guess just to answer your question, really, I just think it's still very early. I think there's a lot of capital in the space, and it's chased an increasing number of like chains and infrastructure. And I think now is the time for a rotation back to some breakout breakout applications. Whether that's still kind of in the financial sector, or if maybe this is the cycle we start to break out into more like social stuff. Things like Lens or Friend Tech or Farcaster. Those are kind of like the three main sort of on-chain social media company or platforms that have kind of launched. But again, for the most part, they still have relatively small adoption.
Yeah. What about Telegram's project? Do you know anything about that? It's like skyrocketed into the top 10. TON is the ticker for that token. Don't own it. Don't know much about it, other than I remember a period when a lot of struggling Web 2 applications, you might remember Kick.com launched Kin. Not struggling, but projects have never reached scales of being like, oh, we're now pivoting to Web 3. And Telegram is still this incredibly popular, widely used app, and it's I think it's the main platform that people in this industry use. And I'm just wondering, like, what's the deal there? Is this going fully crypto native? What's the point of that token? Speaking of like onboarding users and applications, I am genuinely curious about this.
Yeah. So Telegram, it's kind of weird. Because they initially were launching Ton, but then they got stopped by the SEC. And then I believe what happened is they open source all the tech, and there was like a community effort to like relaunch Ton as like a community-led blockchain. And then I think like after the fact, the Telegram team has like incorporated a lot of aspects of the Ton blockchain into Telegram. Like someone was showing on Twitter a couple days ago how you could like create a wallet inside of Telegram incredibly easily. Like there's like a specific command you use, and you can just create your own like Ton crypto wallet inside of the Telegram app, which is pretty crazy. Like that's potentially one of the biggest onboarding funnels and easiest to use onboarding funnels I've ever seen. But there is a couple apps that have been like deploying on Ton and like have gotten some traction. And they're pretty cool because they're like built into the Telegram messaging infrastructure itself. So there's like a lot of kind of like unique things you can do there.
Yeah.
I guess it's hard to know. Like again, I think there's a lot of it is just kind of like no one really. I shouldn't say no one's really heard about it, but like hasn't hit like the crypto mainstream yet about this. Just because, again, partly because I follow the crypto space all the time, and I haven't really heard about it. Partly because like the Telegram team, I don't think is like directly related to the Ton blockchain. Again, I could be wrong there, but that would be like an incredibly cool. It's definitely a cool ecosystem to look at. I mean, it's obviously highly unique and has the best onboarding funnel there is. I mean, I still think like if Twitter launched their own like X blockchain, that would be immediately one of the biggest chains in the world.
Yeah.
And like would be something that developers would want 100% flock to.
Yeah.
So I'm still holding out hope that Elon will
let's go.
His brother wanted to do it. His brother was like pushing for it, but then Elon essentially said that the infrastructure is not ready yet. So maybe as we get closer and closer to that being possible, eventually we get that.
Well, there was a thing that Elon was advising Trump on crypto, which I can only imagine what those conversations are like. But well, we haven't talked about politics at all on the show today, but there's more news. Trump's at a fundraiser in California hosted by David Sachs, who's sort of a very popular, somewhat controversial VC investor because he's got these very strongly held views on politics. And basically Trump's like, I'll be your candidate. I'm the pro-crypto candidate. So he's leaning in pretty hard into that lane, I gather, because it's maybe a way for him to close the gap on the funding on political campaign contributions from Biden, who's outpacing him. But yeah, once again, kind of like surreal that this is an issue that has become a political lightning rod in what will be one of the most consequential elections in our lifetime. So I just think it's insane. It's just crazy.
Yeah, it is wild. It's that it was that classic or sorry, not classic, but I think Balaji, who's like this big, crypto and technology guy, he said 2016 was the first social media election, and 2024 will be the first crypto election.
I got to give that guy credit. He is an unbelievable at coming up with a turn of phrase, like the quip, the perfect sort of way to capture, the moment with that language. I think it's very clever.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting.
So I guess the difference being that in 2016, social media was the platform that people were using to share information and influence the direction of the election. And in this case, it's not just the crypto funding is the thing that's sort of shaping that, but rather that the future of the industry is becoming an issue that's on the table, right? Like in 2016, social media wasn't an election issue. It was an election issue after the election when people were litigating the impact of Facebook and other platforms on the outcome. But it wasn't like an issue that people were really talking about during the election. Whereas now that's how people are approaching crypto. So it's not an exact analogy, but it's a good one nonetheless.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think you actually wrote a great article as well this week. I think that's a good tie-in to your article about Canada and Web3. I'm curious, do you want to tell the audience a little bit about it and the reception to it?
Well, it's sort of local, but hopefully it's something that people can sort of apply in their country of origin. Basically, the point of view was, look, Canada was a leader briefly in Web3. Ethereum was made by a bunch of Canadians. We've got a long history in the Bitcoin world and in the community writ large. But more recently, it's become a total backwater. And part of that is because the industry is growing up globally, and so other places are emerging, and you can't be the only game in town. But also, the conditions here haven't always been as favorable as they could be. And the point I was making in the piece was simply that if the U.S. actually does pivot, and there becomes a bipartisan consensus around this issue, or at least some kind of synthesis where people can agree on a new set of rules that will govern the growth of the industry, where does that leave a country like Canada? And what steps can they take to put themselves back on the right track? So I recommended several different paths or several different things that can be done pretty easily to fix this issue. One is that there was actually a comprehensive parliamentary study on Web3 and blockchain that made 16 recommendations on how to govern the growth of the industry, and none of them have been implemented yet. So step one would be, we have a template created by Parliament, why not put it into practice? Step two was, in Canada, there's a very strong policy of supporting industries and technologies which we think are strategically important. We do that with electric vehicles, we do that with quantum computing, we've done that with AI, with varying degrees of success. But if we're going to do that for industries that are strategic, then we should do this for blockchain and Web3 as well, especially if other countries around the world are creating incentives or developing policies to encourage growth in their countries. We need to be able to match them in certain ways. And then this is a very Canadian specific issue, but there's a set of new tax increases that will be coming into effect pretty soon that will increase basically the capital gains tax for business owners, small businesses, doctors, and wealthy individuals. Basically, their capital gains are going to be taxed at a much higher rate. And so that, I think, is going to probably put a dampening impact on new business formation. It creates less incentives to invest as an angel in a country where we're undercapitalized in general, and where there's a lack of funding for startups, and where a lot of people go to the US and other countries to find access to funding because the sources here are not as deep. So creating rules that make it harder, not easier to create capital formation in the private sector are going to only, I think, slow down the pace of new business formation and have a cooling effect on growth. So that's something that's not crypto specific or Web3 specific, but it's something that I think all entrepreneurs, VCs, founders, small business owners should be very concerned about. So, three suggestions. The third one is kind of a done deal. Like, they're not going to reverse the capital gains tax policy based on my op-ed in the Toronto Star. But the other two suggestions, I hope someone, gives it a serious look and maybe, decides to implement them. And I think if we can just get one of those things done, it will help a lot. So thanks for bringing that up. The piece has become kind of like a touch point for some people in the industry. Received a lot of positive feedback from folks in Canada, I think that unlike in the US, there is no organized sort of voice or lobbying effort for industry. And I think that sometimes it's forgotten about. And I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think a lot of Canadian startups in crypto just end up structuring offshore, even if their team works in Canada. Can't make sense. I mean, I don't know. But I thought, Alex, everyone knew that you could solve a productivity problem with higher taxes on investment.
Yeah,
I thought that was the obvious solution.
Well, not just a productivity problem, a R&D, innovation, and capital investment problem. So, I mean, this is getting pretty in the weeds, but Canada used to spend almost dollar for dollar what the US did on CapEx. So that's investment in plant, equipment, physical infrastructure, et cetera. And now it's 80 cents on the dollar. And part of that is because it's just less appealing to invest now than it used to be. And that's true not just for Canadians, but for foreign investors, which for a country like Canada, by the way, is like a critical source of growth. Like we need to attract foreign capital as well. Anyway, this has now become Canadian politics.
One of the things that's interesting, this is not about Canada specifically, but just in general, is we are increasingly moving towards a world where, tech is a higher and higher share of GDP. And the percentage of people who work in tech who are remote is also up and to the right, and sort of continues to go up and to the right, I would say.
Yeah.
And in a world like that, it doesn't really matter. Like you can kind of incorporate your company wherever. Like it doesn't really matter, especially if you move to a world where you accept payment in crypto and not through traditional fiat. So I am curious to know what that type of future leads to, just because it doesn't really, one of the things I've noticed with a lot of Toronto crypto startups is they're like, why would I ever incorporate in Ontario? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
I'll just incorporate somewhere else, and then I could just live in Toronto and hire employees all across the world.
Yeah.
I saw some people talking about that as well on when the new cap gains tax came out, being like, it's like cap gains taxes and those types of taxes. It's it works obviously in the current economy, but in a future economy where anyone can work from anywhere and anyone can incorporate from anywhere and anyone can accept customers or whatever from anywhere, it's kind of I don't know how well it works in that type of economy. But we're still far away from there, from that being a huge percentage. It's obviously more just on the fringes right now, but it's interesting to see what will happen.
Well, it is interesting. I've probably said this on the show before, but Silicon Valley was once called a tech Galapagos because of the very, unique set of features or conditions that existed there and nowhere else, right? So access to talent, capital, tech companies, government R&D, universities, and other sort of important institutions. Those things existed in other places, but they didn't exist at the same level of concentration and intensity as they did in that part of the world at that point in time, right? The 1990s and 2000s. And that's why, a very unique breed or species of company was able to thrive there and nowhere else. And this time is definitely different. To your point, people are distributed, capital is more distributed, and there are these technology tools that actually make it easier to decentralize organizations. Now, that can just be companies that have a remote-only workforce. That's pretty decentralized. But it could even be DAOs, right? Like an actually crypto-native organization, where instead of equity holders, you have token holders. Instead of employees, you've got contributors, and it's a really fully on-chain entity. Now, we're not at the stage yet where those kinds of that type of structure is being widely used in the economy. It's clearly being used in DeFi and some other areas. But I think that's the direction that we're going. And so it's not like there won't be a Silicon Valley of the future that isn't Silicon Valley, because what's going to happen is that Silicon Valley will remain important, but increasingly organizations will be spread out. They'll be decentralized. Yeah. And so where does that leave a place like Canada or Toronto? Does it matter that we have a bunch of Canadian domiciled businesses in leading cutting edge areas like AI and crypto and so forth? And I would say that maybe it matters a little less than it used to, because we could still be benefits of the remote work revolution, right? Where lots of people are earning high salaries and spending all that money in the local economy, but maybe working for an offshore company. So that exists. But ultimately, if we want to secure our future, secure prosperity for our future, we need to be able to prove that we can develop global champions and nurture them and keep them here. And I think that that's something that we've had some unfortunate missed opportunities on, in the blockchain world. I mean, Ethereum, once again, $500 billion in value. It was never going to stay in Canada per se, because that's not how crypto works. But nobody who you built it is here really, except for a couple of people, and that's a huge economic opportunity lost, right? AI, the godfather of machine learning is Geoffrey Hinton at the University of Toronto. We also, the University of Montreal and McGill similarly have these strong areas of expertise with people who've come out of those schools. And there's definitely some cool AI stuff happening in Toronto, but OpenAI, which has several Canadians in senior management and founder positions, is not based here, obviously. Not that it would have ever been, but there aren't no equivalents, right? So how is it that we, instead of having Canadians go become billionaires in the Valley, which is not a bad thing, I wish them well, but how do we create the conditions for those kinds of organizations to keep a foothold in Canada where we can share in that more equally, I guess, right? And I think, I don't know what the policy answer is. I mean, I provided some ideas. I mean, I think private investment alone, I even say in the op-ed, the private investment alone doesn't solve every social ill in the world or solve every policy goal, but it's the absence of it certainly makes the situation worse, right? And clear regulations they're a necessary but not sufficient reason why a company or a project might get developed. Lots of countries in the world are creating regulatory regimes that are super favorable to Web3, but they're not going to ever be as big or competitive as the US, because the US has got a zillion other things going for it, right? So all of these things need to happen. And each of them alone is not going to move the needle significantly, but every step sort of counts. I don't know, maybe I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but I think we need to try and get as much of this done as we can.
Totally agree. I think, I would say the overwhelming consensus on crypto Twitter is that Ontario is one of the most hostile places to crypto in the entire world. So it's pretty interesting to see, often Canadian founders will kind of get people will reply to them on Twitter being like, what are you doing living there? But obviously it's, still love Canada and Toronto, but it's definitely, it's at least seen as a relatively hostile place.
I mean, I have a slightly different experience. Our firm works in the regulated market, and the regulator here in Ontario was the first to approve crypto asset ETFs, the first to approve staking ETFs. The corporate finance group there has approved lots of listings of companies in the Canadian capital markets that are in this industry. So, I think that probably the point of view of crypto Twitter is overstated and maybe not super knowledgeable about the nuance of what's happening here. But that doesn't mean that we can't be doing better. And it's not really an Ontario thing. There's some federal decision makers that need to, get aligned.
Yeah, it's also part of it is also it's the whole trucker protest. I remember that whole week when that happened.
Oh yeah, well yeah, that's the thing, became politicized, right?
Yeah, it became quite politicized, where people were like, they're seizing people's money in Canada and all that type of stuff. So, but I mean, it is interesting with crypto though that it is, because whenever anyone's like, oh, move out of Toronto, Ontario, go somewhere else, it's like, where do I go? There's no real hub of crypto anywhere. I guess maybe
there's no real hub, but I get accused all the time of being a homer. People think that I defend Canada to a fault. I'm always papering over whatever our deficiencies are. And I actually think that's not true. I just think I'm a patriotic person. But I will say, I don't want to. There's some places in the U.S. I might live, but I don't want to. No offense, I don't want to live in the Middle East or something in the United States.
Yeah, that's that is kind of the alternative. It's
and I know Singapore's great. I just like it here. It's a great place to live. We have an amazing society, an open society, great quality of life. It's an incredible city and country. It's an amazing place to build a life, to start a family, and hopefully it can also be an amazing place to start a business and invest for the long run. You know?
Yeah.
We're almost there.
We're almost there. It's true. It's just missing. It is interesting too. Yeah, because there is really no main hub. The only other hub would be like maybe New York. But the thing is, New York is like, has some issues of its own with crypto. So it's like there's no like, and then most people point to Dubai as like the essentially the global hub of crypto. But I'm too much of a homer like you to move 18 hours away. So
plus my wife would leave me if I suggest like 100% without a doubt, and she'd be in her rights to do it. Hey Andrew, guess what? I just heard from Jake, my associate here, that this is our 150th episode. So maybe we should have planned something more for it. But hey, congratulations, man. I mean, it's been quite a journey. We started this thing like back in, I think, 2021. And we've interviewed some incredible people. I think it's worth maybe just taking stock of that. And I know Jake's actually compiled some of this information. So we've interviewed dozens of founders, several regulators and policymakers. We've interviewed over 10 venture capital investors. The market capitalization combined of the projects that we've talked to is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And we've spoken to the founders of over a dozen unicorns in the process. And we've learned a lot. And I think one thing that I think we've done well is, at least I think we've tried to do well, is to sort of be vulnerable, like to show when we don't understand things, and to be skeptical when we think things aren't accurate or maybe not what people are saying is up to snuff. And I don't think we always get it right, but we try to keep it honest around here. And it's certainly been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed it a lot. And this is not the end of DeFi Decoded. The beatings will continue until morale improves. I think if Bitcoin gets to $1 million, we'll retire. But until then, we will keep it up. So thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure as well. And that's crazy to think it's been 150 episodes. I know.
It
doesn't feel like it, but maybe a little bit less than $1 million.
Yeah, okay.
$1 million would be great.
$1 million would be good too. All right, well, that's it for this week's episode of DeFi Decoded. We will see everybody next week. Don't forget to hit that like button, comment, subscribe, share the episode, and tell people more about the podcast. We'd love to grow our listener base. Until next time, that's it. Take care.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.